Welcome to the Voices for Change virtual tour. We are broadcasting live from Washington, D.C., along with our presenting partners, Ferebee Enterprises International, Love Life Now Foundation, the Pauling Institute, Iowa's Coalition for Collective Change, and OneGen, Voices for Change, technical and strategic partner. Hi, I'm Tracy Schott. I'm a filmmaker and a social worker. And I created Voices for Change to provide survivors of intimate partner violence and the professionals who support them with a platform to support their wisdom. So thank you for joining us. I want to introduce you to our panelist, Janice Ferebee, who is the Chief Woman Warrior at Ferebee Enterprises International and creator of Got It Going On. Lovern Gordon, who is a survivor of childhood domestic violence as well as intimate partner abuse as an adult, and she recently published her memoir, The Legacy He Left Me. She founded the Love Life Now Foundation to raise money for shelters and increase awareness for intimate partner violence. Dr. Stephanie Hargrove serves as the chair of the Research and Evaluation Work Group for UGIMA, the National Center on Violence Against Women in the Black Community. Stephanie is a clinical associate at Duke University Medical Center, where she both researches and treats trauma. Luana Nelson Brown is returning to the Voices for Change virtual tour. She is the executive director of the Iowa Coalition for Collective Change, which specializes in empowering marginalized communities through education, research, and advocacy. And last but not least, Sylvia Pauling is a professional counselor and therapist and founder of the Pauling Institute, an author and an activist and advocate to end domestic violence. You can learn more about our panelists on our website, voicesforchange.net. So we've been talking about gender-based violence all year in this series of webinars, and quite frankly, it's not getting any better. Gender-based violence has reached epidemic proportions around the world. In the United States, Black and Indigenous women face even higher rates than Caucasian, Latina, and Asian women. The rates are staggering. Briefly, 45% of Black women have reported experiencing sexual violence, physical violence, and/or stalking by an intimate partner. 1 in 4 Black girls is sexually abused before the age of 18. 1 in 5 Black women are survivors of rape. Black women ages 25 to 29 are 11 times as likely as white women to be murdered while pregnant or within the first year of childbirth. Gender-based violence is a complex problem across all races, but for Black communities in the United States, the problem is embedded within issues of racism, policing, and cultural oppression. Looking at the systemic issues as well as the individual is imperative for organizations responding to intimate partner violence, and that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to hear from women working in research, prevention, awareness, and treatment to gain a better understanding of these issues and solutions. So let's start by meeting our panelists. Sylvia, you've been working in this space for over 30 years as both an administrator and a clinician. What drew you to this work?
Started doing this work back in the late 80s, early 90s, while in undergrad as an intern. I was impacted by many victims, survivors doing my internship, but later was really drawn to this work after my sister was brutally murdered and her body burned by an acquaintance in 1996. So primarily it started in college, but today I see myself as my sister, who is Devanya. I see myself as Devanya's voice.
We're bringing up a picture of Devanya. So sorry for your loss.
Thank you.
Lovern, could you tell us a little bit about your history?
I come to this work as a 2-time survivor, a child witness to the issue, but as well as a young adult survivor. And oftentimes when, children grow up in these homes where abuse is primarily prevalent, oftentimes children do go on to become victims. But for quite some time, up until I was 15, 16, 17, 18 years old, I kept saying that I would never be me. And I subsequently fell into an young adult relationship while in college at the age of 21 that lasted for almost 2 years. And it involved physical, emotional, and verbal abuse for the entire time until I escaped. And it was when I escaped that I realized that the word help was the most daunting thing for me. I did not realize it was the most dangerous time for me as well. And then, subsequently, 10 years later, after surviving that attack, it's when I formed the Love Life Now Foundation to bring awareness to the resources and help that is available that many people often don't find out about till they get to a police station or a hospital.
It is daunting when you've kind of grown up with it and you tell yourself one thing and then find yourself someplace else.
Absolutely.
Janice, your focus for more than 20 years has been on preventing intimate partner violence by focusing on self-esteem of Black girls. Why is this an important part of understanding this issue?
Well, thank you so much, Tracy, for this invitation. Well, first of all, I believe that Black girls and all girls are one of the world's most precious natural treasures. And my work began almost over 40 years ago as the first African-American models editor for 17 magazine in New York City. And we talk about self-esteem, self-love, valuing oneself are some of the protective tools that especially girls, specifically Black girls and other girls of color, need to have to surround them, because having those specific tools can help them keep away or not so much attract negative relationships, negative individuals, or getting themselves into unhealthy relationships. And in my book, Got It Going On 2, 20th anniversary edition coming out this winter, talking about what is a healthy relationship, because even if you have good self-esteem, if you don't know what a healthy relationship is, you won't know how to steer clear of it. And in my book, I talk about healthy relationships encourage growth and individuality. Unhealthy relationships are based on selfishness and fear. So self-esteem, self-love, and valuing yourself are really what needs to be the protective coating around girls to make sure that they have a safe place and a safe foundation so that they can prevent themselves from becoming a part of a negative or unhealthy relationship.
I love that idea that self-esteem is kind of a protective barrier. I think it's really important. And one of the things that we've talked about in the past is how at different times of your life, you might be more vulnerable to getting into an abusive relationship. So every layer of self-esteem and protection that a young woman has is certainly important. Stephanie, I wanted to ask you to tell me a little bit about how you got into this work.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for asking. So this work has been a passion for me for years. It started with close friends and family who shared various forms of interpersonal and intimate partner violence. Then I wanted to be a part of the change. So I started volunteering in domestic violence shelters and rape crisis hotlines. And I noticed patterns there. But one thing that really sparked my interest was after attending an HBCU for my undergraduate experience, I met so many Black women who shared with me that they experienced various forms of gender-based violence over the course of their life, and so did their family members and friends. But many of them did not disclose or report or talk about those things. And so it really inspired in me a desire to learn more about that phenomenon, to research it, to be a part of the solution, to treat it as a psychologist. So that's what got me into the field. And then in terms of my work with Ujima, I was involved with the DC Coalition Against Domestic Violence, and I was a part of an action research collective there, and then started consulting with Ujima when it was founded in 2016, and I've been working with them ever since. And then recently was asked to be the chair of the research and evaluation work group. And that work group is really focused on disseminating information that would be helpful for advocates and survivors. It's about synthesizing the current research and literature and also producing new literature and research that will be helpful for survivors across the country, and using that information to influence policy and practices. So that's how I got to this point.
So you've been working on getting all that research together. So let's talk a little bit about the scope of the problem. Let's get that big picture from you. What is Ujima seeing? I ran through some statistics early on. Maybe you could dive a little deeper into those numbers.
Yes, of course. So I think we have a slide, a couple slides that we can show. But overall, the bottom line is that Black women are disproportionately impacted by intimate partner violence. When you compare Black women's experiences to women of other racial and ethnic backgrounds, they are disproportionately impacted both in terms of the significance and the lethality of it, as well as the prevalence of it. So here are some statistics around intimate partner violence. Like we mentioned, 45% of Black women reported contact sexual violence, physical violence, and or stalking in her lifetime. So nearly half have reported it. And also, anecdotally, so many survivors have told me that they've never reported to any professional or to any official agency. So who knows how large those statistics actually are. Homicide is a significant problem as well. So the lethality for Black women to experience intimate partner violence is higher than any other group, and compared to white individuals who experience intimate partner violence, it's nearly double. So homicide is a significant issue when we're talking about intimate partner violence for Black women. The rates of stalking are also staggering. About 1 in 5 Black women experience stalking in their lifetime. Nationally, about 9% of Black women were raped in an intimate partner relationship. So also sexual assault and rape have been increasingly problematic in the Black community, and we have some statistics about that as well. So one of the things that I mentioned that applies to intimate partner violence, but also applies to rape, is that for every Black woman who reports rape, at least 15 Black women do not report. And so this is just from one study at one point in time that found that there's so many more Black women who are not getting the opportunity, the access, or feeling safe enough to report these things. And so we don't have an accurate count of these numbers, but we know that it's already significant from the numbers that we have. And then this is an overview of a lot of the statistics related to sexual assault in the Black community. When you see the rates of Black girls being sexually abused before the age of 18, the fact that 40 to 60% of Black women report having some form of intimate partner violence and sexual assault, or being involved in coercive sexual experiences. This is across the board. There's just disproportionate numbers of Black women being involved in coercive power and control situations that are leaving an impact of trauma. And so this is a broad issue that needs further discussion for sure.
Yeah, those numbers are staggering. Tell us a little bit, Luana, about how you became a domestic violence advocate.
So I like to say that I've been doing this pretty much my whole life, pretty much starting at the age of 5. And I know that sounds
crazy, but it's in fact true when you think about what true advocacy is and what it looks like. When I was growing up, we were homeowners and we were landlords. So we lived in a duplex. So our place was upstairs and we rented the place downstairs. And my mother was insistent that we rent to people who needed us, right? So we saw quite a few survivors of domestic violence that lived downstairs from us. And she talked about intimate partner violence with my sister and I early. We were not immune to it. And in fact, she helped us establish advocacy, what I now know to be advocacy. At that point, I didn't have a name for it. I was just doing what I was taught to do. But there was one case in particular where there was a family downstairs with us, and the wife was experiencing domestic violence, and there were two small children, my same age. And whenever things would get particularly violent, there was a safety plan worked out in the house where mom would come to the back door downstairs, and my dog would bark, which would alert my mother. She'd also knock on the wall, alert my mother, and everybody in my family had a role to play to stop the violence. So my job at that time was to get the kids, who were also my friends, bring them up to my room and, have a sleepover if they were going to spend the night. I'd make snacks. I'd put pallets down on the floor next to my bed. And for us, it was playtime, but we all, even at that age, knew instinctively what we were doing was escaping violence or helping them escape violence. But everybody in the family had a role to play. My mother was a nurse, and she would tend to mom. My father would go and tend to dad, who was the abuser in this situation. My sister would get the dog, and my job was to work with the children. So this was how I grew up, really as a domestic violence advocate. And then as I got older, expanded into other forms of intimate partner violence advocacy, sexual assault, and now I do homicide and other violent crime work.
Wow, thanks for that. It is kind of a remarkable story in terms of getting into the work. Lovern, you had a personal story as a victim, and there were some barriers to getting services, and you had, I guess, we are hearing all of these statistics about violence in the Black community, but how does it feel on the inside? What's that like for you? Can you humanize that for us a bit?
Absolutely. And so, at the time of going through the abuse, I didn't coin myself as a victim. I had done everything to be the opposite of who I thought a victim was, which at the time was my mother and all the other women in the community that I grew up in Trinidad and the Caribbean. Now living in the States, I was going to university at nights to study advertising and marketing. I was working an entry-level job in corporate America, and I was on my way to getting my own apartment. And by the time the abuse had ensued and ramped up, and I'd reached my breaking point, I was also at that point now living in my own studio apartment. So I thought, my mother at the time, not thought, but I saw that in my eyes, she was weak at the time. She was uneducated, barely had an elementary school education, and depended heavily on our father for our financial means to take care of us and herself. And I wanted to be, again, opposite of that. So all the while going through this relationship, I thought, even though that I was going through this thing that I knew was bad, it wasn't as bad. And so by the time I got to my breaking point and the doctor presented the word help to me, it meant a plethora of things. It meant at the core, shame. that if anybody found out the extent of what was happening to me, that I would feel extremely ashamed. I already was ashamed, hiding this big, huge lie behind closed doors. I thought that I would be blamed. I thought that my family would say to me, you know what your mother had went through. Why would you let yourself go through this? This is what I was thinking that they would say. I thought that my school was going to find out why I was on my way to flunking my first year of college. I thought that I would have to end up in a shelter, which to me meant a big open room with beds with a bunch of women that I did not know. I didn't want that. So there were all these myths. And then at the very core, I still loved this person that did harm to me. All I wanted was for the abuse to stop. And I thought that if I reported and outed him, that I'd be looked upon in the Black community as a snitch, as someone who put another Black man behind bars or got another Black man in trouble. And when I moved to the States, I had begun to understand the issue of racism and what that looked like and how much harder it was for Black men and, all of these things. So at the end, my safety mattered not. All I wanted was to circumvent the shame, the blame, and to keep him safe. And so when you talk about barriers, we haven't even begun to reach the services barriers. But at the core, the barrier that kind of hit me, quote unquote, and no pun intended, that kind of really sort of was in my face was, what was my community going to think? What was my community going to say? How, could I be ostracized? And I didn't want any of that.
Yeah. So there's a lot to unpack there. We talk about self-esteem and shame and blame, and all of those things become intertwined, right? And so, Janice, could you kind of help us unpack that a little bit? Let's talk a little bit about some of the cultural barriers to help seeking that you've seen in your work as a social worker.
Well, thank you. And thank you, Lovern and the others. She really talked a lot about some of those cultural barriers. We talk about it's none of your business. In the Black community, there's a pathology generation after generation of individuals going through this, that we're not going to tell anybody because we don't want, as Lovern said, we don't want the shame, we don't want the humiliation, the embarrassment, whether it's in the community and school, but the entire community knows exactly what's going on. Because just as Luanis was saying, they even knew, they had a plan, a safety plan. So people in the community know. But again, the embarrassment, it becomes a code of silence. And I remember being, when I went to the University of Pennsylvania to get my master's of social work, in my field placement, one of the girls in the school that I was working at, when I finally did a home visit, found out that she slept with a gun underneath her pillow because her mother's boyfriend was abusing her. And that was shameful. And she finally was taken, and her grandmother was keeping her. But her grandmother, it was dark. By the time I got to go to the home visit, the entire home was dark because the grandmother kept curtains. She didn't want anybody. That was her way of keeping out all of the things that had happened. But again, we talk about this generation after generation, learning to accept the unacceptable. And I want to share with you a book. It's called Black Girl Unlimited by Echo Brown. And she, Echo Brown, the remarkable story of a teenage wizard. She does an excellent job of unpacking what we're talking about, just how the Black community keeps addiction, keeps rape, keeps incest, keeps all of this packed inside the community, making it more and more difficult for help to come. And I love that Lovern talked about the word help, but it's the barriers, those cultural barriers, that Black people, we don't talk about our business. And that's a major prevention tool or it keeps individuals from getting the help that they need. So we need to work on breaking down those barriers and letting people know that it is important to get help, that self-esteem, the value, the self-love, knowing that you are enough and that it is okay to move outside of that community of really insanity and dysfunction.
Yeah, so it is, we keep talking about, I see this as just trying to go through all these layers of barriers to getting help. So we've talked about kind of cultural barriers, barriers around self-esteem and self-blame, barriers around the community at large in terms of what's okay and what's not, and then looking at kind of some societal barriers. And so, Luana, I wanted to ask you to kind of dive a little bit deeper into some of the historical context that this has grown up in and how we've gotten here.
So, yeah, that's a long story, long question, but yeah, everything that Sylvia was just talking about is very real. That lack of trust, the fear, and all of the layers that exist did not just happen today or yesterday. The history of law enforcement itself has grown out of slave patrols. So at one point in history during slavery, everything about being Black was illegal. It was illegal to protect yourself against sexual assault. It was illegal to protect yourself against homicide and other violence. It was illegal to vote. It was illegal to read. And so what has happened is the way those laws were enforced then was the beginning of what we see as law enforcement today. So those biases, those ideas have all been carried with us along with trauma. So trauma is generational. And through the generations, what we see now is a system that has evolved out of an act of dehumanization and criminalization of being Black. And you see a community that has evolved out of the trauma of being dehumanized and criminalized for being Black. So once you start to unpack, what does it look like now and how do we rectify this situation, we would be doing a disservice if we did not pay homage to the history, because we bring our histories with us. And it makes sense for us to start to look at public safety a little bit differently. As we've been going on today, we've been saying, how do we get people help, assuming that law enforcement is help? And oftentimes, because of our history and because of our current state as well, it may not be help. So help and what public safety looks like is what we should really start talking about. And the only people that really know that is the survivors. I heard Sylvia herself say that the survivor knows the abuser better than anybody else. The survivor also knows the solution for their situation better than anybody else. So hopefully that was a long answer to address that, the fact that we cannot ignore the historical context, and we cannot ignore what denotes true public safety for the community and for the survivors. And the only way to do that is to talk to survivors.
Stephanie, I know that's a perspective that Ujima brings to this work. Could you talk a little bit about the services that are available to women in the Black community and where the gaps are?
Yes, there are so many different resources that could be useful for survivors of intimate partner violence. That includes legal resources, housing resources, medical, therapeutic, and the list goes on. So honestly, there are a lot of different avenues where survivors could you, and there are avenues that have been established, but there are some gaps, like we started to talk about and discuss the barriers. So right now, survivors can access support and resources on two main levels, either the national level, which are organizations like UG that services nationally and provides resources on their website, but primarily caters to serving the advocates that serves local communities. And then there's also a national resource called NRCDV, which is the National Resource Center for Domestic Violence. And that also has a lot of information, toolkits, resources to equip and empower survivors. So that's kind of like the broad national level. And then on the local level, there are coalitions against domestic violence in most kind of regions, but then there are usually local domestic violence shelters and agencies. And so those are the main places where survivors might interface with getting resources. The gaps and the issues are that often there's more need than the resources available. Often the resources in the domestic violence agencies are underfunded, they're understaffed, and they are not given the correct time or the appropriate amount of time and equipping to help the survivors be most or to be served the best way that they can. And so often we see that survivors go to shelters or to agencies and still don't really get all the things that they need. And so some of the resources that I've seen in my work have come from community connections and local grassroots movements where people are coming together in their community and connecting with one another, kind of in an informal way, but in a way that makes sense for the Black community, the way that we have shown up for each other for centuries. And the only issue is that not everyone has connections and those supports. And so one of the things that needs to happen is for the organizations that are established in local communities, they need to have more funding, more staffing, and better training for people to serve the community that they serve in the Black women that come who experience IPV. And they need to connect with those who are doing things successfully in the community and informal and in ways that are culturally responsive. And so those things all need to happen with greater frequency and with a lot more support.
Thank you. It's so there are a lot of organizations in the United States that address intimate partner violence, but I'm not. I guess what I'm hearing is we don't necessarily all address intimate partner violence in the Black community equally. And so this is a question, I'm kind of throwing this out at you. I know this wasn't a pre-planned question, so sorry right now, everybody. I just wanted to, when Stephanie was talking, it made me think that, if I'm the organizer of a domestic violence organization, and I know a lot of our viewers are, what do I need to do? What are a couple of things that we need to do to serve the Black community better? How do we address the needs of the Black community in a more effective way than maybe what we're doing right now?
As it stands, meeting folks where they're at in our communities is, for me, where it starts. Oftentimes, as many have said, that victims and survivors will not pick up the phone and call police. They're not their first point of contact because the trust is not there, and the level of fear is there. So, and they're not going to be looking for resources because they're faced with leaving, and leaving in itself is daunting. And there's so many things that come along with leaving, right? We all know that does not look black and white for victims that are seeking to escape. So meeting folks where they're at in the community whether that be through churches. We know the Black community is heavy on the faith side. So meeting them at church, going to implore pastors and clergy to offer domestic violence awareness presentations, during or throughout the year, having an advocate's number on hand, whatever the nearby domestic violence agency is, so that they can call and sort of point them in the right direction for help should they be faced with someone in their congregation that needs help. Going to the barbershops and the salons where we know we talk to our hairstylists, right? Our hair is, one of those things where we sit down and we start chatting, and our hairstylists get a lot. They get a lot of information on any given day about what's happening. Going out into the community, serving folks, the homeless, meeting the homeless community where they're at to offer resources. Because if we're experiencing domestic violence behind closed doors, you can imagine for women of color on the streets. And so meeting them where they're at to offer resources. And so there's so many avenues that I believe that we can sort of drive the resources to folks. And again, meeting them where they're at, that, there's endless opportunity to serve folks, in the Black community once we sort of put our heads together and figure out where do we gather and how can we disseminate the information to reach people who really need it.
That's a great answer. Does anybody else have something to add to that?
So I think as Lovern was saying, reaching people where they are. A prime example is I'm a psychotherapist, but before someone can get to therapy to even try to work through their journey, domestic violence, trauma, all of that, it is you really do have to meet them where they are. So, for example, if someone is homeless and they have or is forced to be homeless because of domestic violence and they don't have any place to live, or they have no idea where their next meal is going to come from, that has to be addressed before we can even begin to work through the layers that may come with being a survivor of domestic violence. So I would agree with meeting survivors where they are, and also for communities that don't understand or don't know, to reach out. There is so many resources. For example, even for the Black church, if you do not have a resource manual or some sort to reach out to your community domestic violence program to find out how to best help someone in your church that's struggling, as opposed to some of the the ways that we are led to address it. But if to reach out to the professionals in the field to try to get the actual help. And I think so often, just we as a community, we're suffering in silos, even our communities within communities. And the only way to change that is for domestic violence to be exposed. And, Janice and I, we met at a program within a community in a dress shop, in a woman's dress shop. And so, but it was on domestic violence. And so those things do work and are extremely helpful.
Thanks. Yeah. Silos, something that we always seem to come back to on this webinar, is talking about how we have to come together as a community. And unfortunately, in this whole webinar, we're in silos, right? It feels that way a bit. Stephanie, I think you had something you wanted to add to this conversation.
Sure, yeah. I completely agree with what was said to this point. Meeting survivors where they are and, connecting with community organizations, understanding the hierarchy of needs is really important. And I just wanted to add something that I think about from the research that has been done, is that Black women are experiencing intersectional forms of oppression, right? And so taking an intersectional lens, I think, is also really important for advocates and for organizations to understand that the intersection of racism, sexism, classism, and other isms are compounding, and it's not additive, it's multiplying the impact of the trauma that they're experiencing and the barriers that they have to navigate. And so organizations need to understand those varied layers, take into account the history like we talked about before, and then implement practices that are inherently addressing that intersectional lens, right? So power sharing, making sure that power is distributed, and that it's not just someone kind of telling survivors what they need to do or what should be their path, but having them, make that decision for themselves. Organizations having a policy of authenticity and individualized services, like others said, very catered to what this survivor needs, not based on stereotypes or overarching themes of what you think they might need, but what they say they want. And then also, advocates and services should, or systems should be able to advocate for the survivor, right? And have a lens and be ready to respond to various forms of oppression with advocacy and with the responsiveness that would help them actually break down some of those barriers.
What are some of the things that organizations need to address in order to become more culturally competent?
We do things a little differently here in our coalition. Our coalition was founded specifically at the intersection of oppression and violence, and understanding that oppression is violence. And most agencies and coalitions in this field, let's just be honest, are white run, and we're not founded in that sense. So some of the things that we do is we train our member programs on how to power share, which is something that Stephanie just mentioned. And that takes some time. It sounds easy. Okay, well, we'll promote Black women. No, it's not just that. There has to be a sense of value and true power. What does your board look like? What does your budget look like? Where is your money going? Are you investing in the community? Because if you bring this all together, we talked about how survivors know what's best, mentioned how we need to meet survivors where they are. And I told you my story of what it looks like when the community is doing safety planning. So there are folks in the community that are already there. We're talking about meeting people where they are. There are people that are already there, like Lovern mentioned hairstylists, right? They're already there. They're already meeting survivors where they are, but they have zero resources. So what something that organizations can do is start to have the critical conversation about funding and resourcing the actual community. What are, who are those agencies that are, or even individuals that are working informally that are truly doing the work right now? And it's all encompassing work. So they're addressing houselessness, they're addressing food insecurity and food deserts, mutual aid organizations where communities are helping communities. It's time for our industry to start expanding the table and making room. And that is how we conduct our training from our coalition standpoint. We're starting to have those difficult conversations with our member programs. And I'll just be honest, sometimes it's, your agency can't do it. You are not structured in a way to be able to do it. So who is the agency that can? And how do we bring that agency into the industry and properly resource and outfit that agency? So I know it's sometimes what I say is controversial and people don't like it, but it's real. If our real goal is to end intimate partner violence in the Black community, then it's time to start talking about resourcing and outfitting the Black community and addressing intimate partner violence in an intersectional way.
I'm an old social worker with that old do-gooder philosophy, and it came from the heart. But I hear you when you say that we need to power share with organizations within the community to do a better job of responding to the needs of women in the Black community.
Well, I just want to say thank you, Luana, for what you just said. I talk about if you don't love our children, please get away from them. And seriously, and that's when we talk about cultural competence. What is cultural competence? When you consider a career, especially like what you just said, Tracy, in human services, it's important to understand that different cultures have different traditions, have different experiences, and cultural competence deals with understanding that, and that people have different needs, but being empathetic, not trying to tell people what to do. And we've talked about, and this goes for anywhere, but for me with prevention and for what the other ladies were saying, meeting people where they are. But why is cultural competence so important? Why is it so important to know about those nuances and traditions? It encourages the acknowledgement and acceptance of different appearances, different behavior and culture. And it really means that I see you. And as a docent or a former docent at the National Museum of African American History and Culture, what Luana and Stephanie talking about, the origins of policing and how Africans were treated so badly, and how Africans, just the look, how you look, our facial features, our texture. And for me, being the first African American models editor of 17 magazine, just understanding and knowing, growing up, that Black was not beautiful for such a long time, but having that knowledge that it's important to understand. You don't have to be Black to respect and learn about and understand Blackness. And that's why it's important for cultural humility. That's the other thing. Some believe that cultural competence is practiced by merely showing respect to everyone that they encounter without considering your own bias, but it's important to know that you're not an expert. Always be willing to ask questions and understanding that you do not know or cannot fully know someone, but the fact that you're willing to ask questions. So, and I'm just going to share a little bit more. So I think that's so important, cultural competence, especially in the prevention, where there are a lot of white organizations like Girl Scouts, Girls Inc., Girls on the Run, or white teachers that do not have the cultural competence because they're not willing. And that's exactly what Luana was saying. If you're not willing to learn, or if you're not set up, then you need to move away or provide services or resources that can help Black girls or other girls of color. But then we get into the whole thing of adultification, just real quickly. And that is a bias that it's a prejudice where children of minority groups, such as African Americans, are treated as being more mature than they actually are by reasonable social standards. And this has come from a report, Girlhood Interrupted, the erasure of Black girls' childhood, from the Georgetown Law Center and Poverty and Inequality Initiative on Gender Justice and Opportunity. And it just talks about how Black girls need less nurturing, Black girls need less protection, are being supported less, being comforted less, that they're more independent. But this adultification, it's important for individuals to be culturally competent so they know that what that is, and that they know when they are treating Black girls like that, because it means that you're not seeing the girl child, the Black girl child, as she truly is. And cultural competence, again, is so important to acknowledge the nuances and the tradition, and to be seen.
Lovern, give us a little synopsis. I know you're literally a girl on the run today, headed off to your next book signing and speaking engagement. But I'd like to hear a little bit about how having some of this cultural understanding in place could have impacted your experience as a survivor.
Absolutely. And so I think, they say when you know more, you do better, or when you know better, you do better. And I do believe that if I had had the understanding that help was available, that it wasn't going to mean me ending up in a big open room with a bunch of people that I didn't know, that I would have had my own room, and my privacy would have been there. And the goal would have been to get me safe. Had I had understood that safety planning was an option, and what that entailed, had I known that my safety was at the core of all of this, and thinking about what could be potentially thought about me with regards to having this man punished for what he was doing to me. Between the, deciding and telling him for real that I was done, and him not wanting to hear that and trying to break into my apartment with a crowbar and cutting my phone lines in my basement, to me finally calling police, to then it turning into stalking, where he was showing up at any given point and leaving really nasty derogatory notes on my car every morning, to then me finally deciding that I was going to file a restraining order. Had I known that, all of this could have somehow been circumvented with, again, the help of safety planning and the help of an advocate, and reaching out to those that cared about me, it could have been a game changer. But, all of these things happened. It's now led me here to now doing this work, and now for 10 years next month. And I'm entirely grateful, because again, I've been able to see over the last 10 years, again, being on the front lines and what that means, for advocates that work at these agencies that we've talked about today. What it means to meet survivors where they're at. So the things that I've talked about, meeting the homeless, we do that once a quarter. Going to churches and speaking, we try to do that as well. But again, there's so many organizations that exist on the ground, that provide these services that Luana talked about, that, Stephanie talked about. We all have the ability to do and be a part of the solution. It's just sort of asking yourself how. And before that even happens, is getting educated on the issue, because that's not my business, and this needs to stay here, and it's not, anything to involve you. It really has to become about awareness, and prevention. And we all have the ability to do that.
So what do you think, Sylvia? Have we made progress?
I believe there is dual work to continue to help survivors, but work to hold perpetrators accountable in churches, in the Black community as a whole, all of those things. And because that is the individual that if they don't have a criminal record that is going to have them placed in a system for years, a criminal justice system, that's the individual that is going to come back out to the same community and either continue to abuse the survivor he was with or they were with, or abuse someone else. So we have lots of work to do in this area. But again, I think we've done better we've done better in stopping the victim blaming, but we haven't done so well with holding perpetrators accountable for their behavior.
Yep, I hear you. Stephanie, what do you think? Are we making progress?
We are in some ways and we are not in others, right? So the ways in which we've made progress are, like others have said, we have decreased the victim blaming somewhat. And there's a little bit more awareness that, and acceptance that, like, women have the right to their own bodies and to say no and to have protection and all of these things. Agencies have been formed and are growing. One of the things that we need to do to advance this area is to understand Black women specifically, right? By understanding the social, political, historical context that influences their day-to-day lives, the social barriers for them to even get help, and then the very things that would help them heal the most may not be the things that we consider traditional, right? And so we have to get out of a Eurocentric and white only bubble to understand what Black women specifically need in order to heal, grow, thrive, and be free from these experiences.
Thank you. I'm hearing that again. It kind of comes back to that idea of help coming from within the community. How are we doing, Luana? Are we making progress?
I will say that, what's already been said, I mean, really hits home. Stephanie brought it home. Sylvia hit the nail on the head. We've made progress in some areas. We're having this webinar today. We're talking about it. We've brought awareness in some ways and decreased victim blaming in some ways. And we still have a long way to go around what does it look like to hold perpetrators accountable, really hold them accountable socially, emotionally, physically, all of it. And also, involving the community. We've got to de-center whiteness in this industry, and we've got to expand the industry to be inclusive of all survivors, but particularly for Black female survivors, because we are dying. We have to start thinking about our industry as not even just in the bubble of domestic violence. But as you heard Sylvia mention about her sister who was murdered, there's a need for funding around homicide advocacy as well. So because we as Black women, we experience all types of violent crime. In that one story Sylvia mentioned, she talked about homicide, or it was Lovern also, talked about stalking, talked about assault, talked about robbery and break-in. All of those are violent crimes that are connected to Black female survivors of intimate partner violence. So we got to start thinking outside of our traditional way of doing DV, because it was built on white female survivors' experiences, and start expanding what the table looks like. So we're not necessarily, when we talk about power sharing, we're not meaning, okay, you have to hand over all your power. Think more in terms of expanding and making room, and get out of the notion of scarcity notion, like there's no resources, like there's only this many resources. That's not true. And if this industry has to fight and go to Congress and lobby for more resources, then that's what we need to do to expand the table and expand the services to really reach Black women and Black survivors where we are.
Thank you. Janice, you get the last word.
Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you all for being here, and thank you, Tracy, for this important webinar. I would say, for my side of the fence, prevention. All of these issues, we must arm our Black girls and other girls of color with self-esteem, self-love, value, powers of example, not the bad example and the crazy that we see on television, social media. There must be other places and spaces for them, like healing circles, like Got It Going On, books and programs that are culturally competent, and people out there that love and respect Black girls and Black women. I talk about speaking life to Black girls and other girls of color, for they become what you tell them. And it's so important. The prevention starts so that we don't have to deal with, although we are going to. But if we can get our girls to start loving themselves and valuing who they are, they will put their arm up and they will say no quicker. They will have a core group. There will be a community out there that is supporting them, so that Luana, Sylvia, Stephanie, the work that they are doing, and Lovern, will not have to be so, we won't have to pull up that heavy load. But until then, we've got to have culturally competent programs, prevention, social emotional learning in schools, churches, everywhere, juvenile justice facilities, but safe spaces, safe places, resources, books that can help to bind and surround our girls. So again, speak life to Black girls, for they become what you tell them.
Wow. Well, that is a wonderful positive note in which to end this webinar. I want to thank each of you for being here. I've been honored to share your wisdom with the Voices for Change virtual tour. Thank you to our panelists for the work you are doing to prevent gender-based violence. For more information on this and other resources available for training for law enforcement, criminal justice professionals, nurses, and domestic violence advocates, please visit voicesforchange.net.